The conference room was packed. Glass walls, long marble table, screens glowing with faces from across the world. A dozen executives sat stiff-backed in leather chairs, laptops open, notepads untouched. The air smelled like expensive cologne and burned coffee, and right there, standing at the far end of the table, clutching a thin folder to her chest, was her. She was shaking, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough that if you looked closely, you'd see it in her hands. In the way her shoulders rose and fell too fast. In the way her eyes kept blinking, trying desperately not to spill tears in a room that had already decided she didn't belong. "Did you even read the brief?" the man barked. His voice cut through the room like a blade. The team lead, Mark Havorson, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, lips curled in a smirk that said he was enjoying this, enjoying breaking her. His voice was loud on purpose, projected not just to the room but into the speaker system connecting dozens of remote attendees. "I mean seriously," he continued, laughing under his breath. "This is what we're calling analysis now. I've seen better structure in a high school book report." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. On the far side of the table, a woman glanced down at her phone. Another man pretended to type, eyes fixed on his keyboard. No one spoke. The young black woman swallowed hard. I followed the framework you shared last week," she said softly. Her voice barely made it past the hum of the projector. "I triple-checked the data. The projections align with—" Mark slammed his palm on the table. "No, don't do that," he snapped. "Don't waste our time trying to sound smarter than you are." The room went dead silent. Her cheeks burned. Every eye was on her now. She could feel them, not curiosity, not concern, but judgment. The kind that strips you down and decides your worth in seconds. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to sound dangerous. "Let us be honest. You were hired to fill a quota, and it shows." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Someone at the back actually raised their phone, the camera lens glinting as it began to record. The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. "Look at her," Mark continued, gesturing openly like she wasn't even human. "Does she look like someone who understands market dynamics, or like someone who just memorized a few buzzwords and hoped no one would notice?" A few nervous chuckles escaped. Most people stared straight ahead, frozen, her vision blurred. She felt herself shrinking, folding inward, wishing, just for a second, that the floor would open up and swallow her whole. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can revise it. I can stay late. I just—" "Oh, spare us the victim act," Mark cut in. "This isn't charity. This is a serious company. We don't have time to babysit people who clearly aren't cut out for this level." On the screen behind him, dozens of muted video tiles stared back, faces watching from New York, London, Singapore. Some leaned closer. Some whispered to colleagues off camera, but no one unmuted, no one stepped in. Humiliation wrapped around her like a vice. Her knees felt weak. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Mark straightened, voice rising again. "Sit down, or better yet, maybe you should reconsider whether you even belong in this meeting." That was it. That was the moment something inside her cracked. Her eyes glistened now, tears clinging desperately to her lashes. She nodded not because she agreed, but because she didn't trust herself to speak without breaking completely. And just as she turned slightly, preparing to retreat to her chair in silence, a calm, unfamiliar voice came through the speaker. "Mark," it said evenly, "I think that's enough." Every head snapped toward the screen. The voice hadn't been loud, but it carried weight. Mark frowned, clearly irritated. "Excuse me, this is an internal team discussion. Whoever just jumped in, you're on mute for a reason." There was a brief pause, then the voice returned, colder this time, sharper. "I'm not on mute," it said, "and I've been listening very carefully." A ripple of confusion spread across the room. People glanced at the participant list on the screen. Names scrolled, titles flashed. The young woman froze mid-step, her heart skipped, because something in that voice, something steady, something certain made her feel, for the first time all morning, that she wasn't completely alone. Mark scoffed. "Well, congratulations. You've heard a performance review. That's how adults work. If you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with HR." The voice responded without hesitation. "Oh, I will," it said. "And so will the board." The room went ice cold. Mark's smile faltered. Phones slowly lowered. Whispers died instantly. The woman turned fully toward the screen now, her breath caught in her throat, because suddenly she had the strangest feeling that someone on that call knew exactly who she was, and that everything was about to change. Question of the day: have you ever witnessed someone being judged or humiliated unfairly at work, in school, or in public, while everyone else stayed silent? What did it make you feel, and what do you think should have been done differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Mark opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, the screen shifted. A new video tile expanded, and the man about to speak next was someone Mark Havorson should have recognized immediately. He just didn't know it yet. Let's go back to how this story truly began this morning. The morning began long before the sun rose. In a narrow apartment tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a liquor store with flickering neon lights, Aaliyah Thompson lay awake on a thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling above her. The paint peeled in soft curls like tired hands letting go. She had been awake for hours, listening to the city breathe, sirens in the distance, a bus groaning as it turned the corner, someone arguing somewhere down the block. Aaliyah was 26 years old, but the weight she carried made her feel older. Not bitter, not hardened, just seasoned. Life had taught her lessons early, and she had learned them quietly, without complaint. She turned her head and looked toward the small bed beside hers. Her mother, Ruth Thompson, slept there, breathing shallowly. An oxygen machine hummed softly at her side, its rhythm now as familiar to Aaliyah as her own heartbeat. Ruth's face, once full and animated, had grown thinner over the years, illness carving lines where laughter used to live, congestive heart failure. The words still sounded unreal, even after 2 years. Aaliyah eased herself up, careful not to make a sound. She pulled on an old sweater and padded barefoot across the cold floor. In the tiny kitchen, she filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. The cupboards were nearly empty, rice, canned beans, half a loaf of bread folded into a plastic bag. She didn't sigh, she never did. Instead, she moved with quiet purpose, the kind that came from knowing there was no one else to do these things if she didn't. As the kettle warmed, Aaliyah checked her phone. 5:12 a.m., 3 missed emails, one from HR reminding her of the morning meeting, one from her landlord sent late last night, marked urgent, and one from the pharmacy, another automated reminder about her mother's prescription refill. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She locked the screen and slipped it into her pocket. "Ali," her mother's voice called weakly from the bed. Aaliyah was at her side in seconds. "I'm here, Mama." Ruth opened her eyes, smiling faintly. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" Aaliyah brushed a hand over her mother's hair, smoothing it back gently. "I slept enough." They both knew that wasn't true. "You've got that big meeting today," Ruth said, trying to sound upbeat. "The one you ironed your blazer for 3 times." Aaliyah smiled despite herself. "It's important. You're important," her mother corrected softly. "Don't let anyone make you forget that." Aaliyah nodded, though experience had taught her how fragile that truth could be. She helped her mother sit up, adjusted the oxygen line, and brought her warm tea in a chipped mug that read "World's Best Mom." Ruth had given it to her years ago when Aaliyah was still in college, working 2 jobs and pretending she wasn't exhausted. "You don't have to rush," Ruth said, guilt creeping into her voice. "I'll be fine." "I know," Aaliyah replied gently, "but I want to make you breakfast first." She toasted the last 2 slices of bread and split them evenly, spreading a thin layer of margarine on each. She cut one in half and handed it to her mother, keeping the smaller piece for herself. They ate in silence for a moment. Aaliyah's mind wandered, as it often did, to the path that had brought her here. Scholarships earned through sleepless nights. A degree in data analytics she had clawed her way toward while classmates partied and networked. Internships where she was mistaken for administrative staff. Interviews where she was told she was impressive but somehow never quite the right fit. This job, this role at a fast-growing tech firm, had been her breakthrough, or so she'd thought. She believed in the work, believed in the numbers, believed that if she just kept her head down and did her job twice as well, eventually she'd be seen. That belief was what carried her every morning when doubt tried to pull her back into bed. After breakfast, Aaliyah helped her mother take her medication, carefully counting pills, checking the labels twice. Then she dressed for work in the small bathroom mirror, adjusting her collar, smoothing her hair into a neat low bun. The blazer was second-hand, but clean. The shoes scuffed, but polished. Everything about her appearance was intentional, not flashy, not careless. She had learned long ago that she didn't get the luxury of being unprepared. Before leaving, she knelt beside her mother's bed. "I'll call you on my break," she said, "and I'll be back early." Ruth reached out, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "No matter what happens today," she said firmly, "I am proud of you." Aaliyah's throat tightened. "I love you, Mama. I love you more." She grabbed her bag and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp, biting through her sweater. The street was already alive. Vendors setting up carts, kids waiting for buses, people rushing past with eyes fixed forward. Aaliyah blended into the flow, another working woman trying to outrun the weight of the day. As she walked toward the bus stop, she allowed herself one small, fragile hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today the work she had poured herself into would finally speak louder than assumptions. She had no idea how cruel the world was about to be, and no idea how powerful the truth waiting behind that screen truly was. By the time Aaliyah stepped off the bus downtown, the knot in her stomach had tightened into something sharper, something that made it hard to breathe. Her phone buzzed again. She already knew what it was before she looked. The pharmacy. She stopped at the corner, the glass towers of the financial district rising around her like cold, indifferent giants. People in tailored coats streamed past, coffee cups in hand, laughter spilling easily from their lips. Aaliyah felt suddenly small, like she didn't belong in the same frame. She answered the call. "Hello, this is Aaliyah Thompson." "Ms. Thompson," the pharmacist said, voice polite but firm, "I'm calling about your mother's medication. The refill was due yesterday." "I know," Aaliyah said quickly. "I just need one more day. I get paid tomorrow. I promise I'll come first thing in the morning." There was a pause on the line. "I'm sorry," the pharmacist replied, "but without payment we can't release the medication. Your mother has already exceeded the grace period." Aaliyah's fingers curled around her phone. "Please," she said, lowering her voice as people brushed past her. "She can't miss another dose, her doctor said." "I understand," the pharmacist interrupted gently. "But my hands are tied." The call ended. Aaliyah stared at the dark screen, her reflection faintly visible. Her eyes looked tired. Older than 26. Fear flickered there now, raw and unfiltered. She did the math in her head for the 100th time, her checking account balance, the late fees already stacked on her rent, the utility bills she'd pushed off again. Even if she skipped meals for the rest of the week, it wouldn't be enough. Her mother's medication wasn't optional. Without it, Ruth's breathing would worsen. Fluid would build in her lungs. The risk of hospitalization of something worse would skyrocket. Aaliyah pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass of a building, grounding herself. She had tried everything. She applied for emergency assistance, denied, reached out to charities, waitlisted, called her aunt in Ohio, who was barely scraping by herself, asked her bank for a short-term extension, rejected. There was no safety net left, only today, only this meeting. She straightened slowly, squaring her shoulders as she entered the building where she worked. The lobby was all marble floors and minimalist art, wealth displayed without apology. Her badge beeped as she passed through the turnstile, the sound echoing louder than it should have. Upstairs, the tension followed her. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and reviewed her presentation again. Charts, forecasts, risk assessments. She had spent weeks refining it, late nights after her mother slept, early mornings before dawn. This project mattered, not just for her career, for her life. If she could impress the leadership team, if she could secure a permanent role, a bonus, anything, she might finally breathe. She might finally stop choosing between rent and medicine, between dignity and survival. But the email from her landlord burned in her pocket. Final notice. If she didn't pay by the end of the week, they would begin eviction proceedings. Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly. When the meeting invite popped up, 10:00 a.m. sharp, her pulse spiked. She gathered her notes and headed to the conference room, each step heavier than the last. Inside, executives filtered in, laughter bouncing off glass walls. Mark Havorson sat at the head of the table, already exuding authority. He barely glanced at her as she took her seat. The call connected. Faces filled the screen. This was it, her chance or her collapse. As Mark began running the agenda, Aaliyah's phone vibrated again. Another message from the pharmacy. Another reminder that time was running out. She silenced it and focused forward, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Just get through this, she told herself, just one good moment. One. When Mark finally called her name, her heart leapt into her throat. "Aaliyah," he said flatly, "let's see what you've got." She stood, smoothing her blazer, and began to speak, and for the first few seconds it was okay. She explained the data clearly, walked through her projections, pointed out risks others had missed. But then Mark interrupted. "Hold on," he said, squinting at the screen. "This doesn't make sense." Aaliyah paused. "If you look at slide 7, no," he snapped. "I'm looking at it, and I'm telling you this is sloppy." Her stomach dropped. She tried again, tried to explain, tried to stay calm, but with every sentence, Mark's tone grew sharper, more dismissive, more personal. And as his voice rose, something inside Aaliyah began to fracture, because this wasn't just about a presentation anymore. This was about whether she would walk out of that room with hope, or walk back home to her mother with nothing. As Mark leaned forward, preparing to tear her apart in front of everyone, Aaliyah realized something terrifying. She had reached the end of the road, and humiliation was the price of asking for one last chance. If anyone had looked closely at Aaliyah as she sat there, waiting for Mark to finish tearing into her slides, they might have noticed how tightly she was holding herself together. Her back was straight, her chin lifted, but inside her thoughts were racing, colliding, spiraling into places she tried desperately to keep hidden. She thought of her mother's labored breathing that morning. She thought of the orange prescription bottle sitting empty on the kitchen counter. She thought of the eviction notice folded carefully into her bag as if neatness could soften its cruelty. And yet, beneath all that fear, there was still something else. Hope, small, fragile, but stubborn. Because before this meeting, before Mark's voice began to sharpen, Aaliyah had allowed herself to believe that this building, this place of glass and steel, might finally be the doorway to a different life. Her journey here hadn't begun this morning. It had begun years ago on cracked sidewalks and overcrowded buses, with textbooks balanced on her knees and exhaustion burning behind her eyes. It had begun with professors who doubted her, managers who underestimated her, and interviews where smiles never reached people's eyes. Every step forward had required courage, and today was no different. As Mark dismissed her explanations with a wave of his hand, Aaliyah's mind drifted back to the moment she'd stood outside this very building earlier that morning. She had paused at the revolving doors, watching her reflection in the glass. A young black woman in a modest blazer. Hair neatly pulled back, eyes determined but tired. She remembered adjusting her bag on her shoulder and whispering to herself, "You belong here." The memory felt distant now. Around her, the conference room hummed with quiet judgment, the soft tap of keyboards, the rustle of papers, the unspoken message that she was an inconvenience, an interruption to the real business being done. Mark's voice pulled her back. "So," he said, smirking slightly, "do you actually have anything useful to add? Or should we move on?" Heat flooded her face. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the invisible line separating her from everyone else seated comfortably around the table. Their tailored suits, their easy confidence, their unspoken certainty that they belonged. Her own reflection flickered faintly in the glass wall. For a moment, fear threatened to win. What if they're right? A cruel voice whispered in her head. What if you really don't belong here? But then another voice rose, quieter, steadier. "You didn't come this far to disappear." Aaliyah took a breath. "I do," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "If I may finish explaining the assumptions behind the model." Mark laughed, not loudly, but enough. "Assumptions," he repeated. "That's cute." The word stung. She glanced briefly at the screen, at the grid of faces watching from across the world. Somewhere in that digital crowd were people she had never met, people with power, with influence, with the ability to change everything. She didn't know it yet, but one of them was listening far more closely than anyone realized. As the meeting dragged on, Aaliyah's fear walked hand in hand with her hope. Every time Mark cut her off, she felt herself shrinking. Every time she forced herself to speak anyway, that small flame inside her flickered brighter. She remembered her mother's words, "Don't let anyone make you forget who you are." Outside the conference room, sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the city below. People hurried along sidewalks, unaware that inside this room, a young woman's future hung in the balance. When Mark finally gestured sharply toward her seat, signaling that she should stop talking, Aaliyah hesitated. For a split second, she considered sitting down quietly, letting the moment pass, preserving what little dignity she had left. But then she remembered the pharmacy call, she remembered the empty bottle, and she realized she couldn't afford silence. She stood there, heart pounding, and said the words that would change everything. "With respect," she began, "the data supports this recommendation, and I'm willing to answer any questions." The room stilled. Mark's smile vanished. He leaned forward, eyes hard, clearly offended by her refusal to shrink. And in that moment, right as the tension snapped tight as a wire, Aaliyah felt it. That familiar pause, that gathering of courage. The same pause she'd felt at the entrance of this building. The same breath she'd taken before stepping inside. She had crossed the threshold. Whatever came next, there was no turning back. Mark Havorson did not like being challenged, especially not by someone he had already decided was beneath him. The room seemed to contract as he rose slowly from his chair, placing both hands on the table as if to steady himself, not from anger but from the performance of authority. His tailored suit stretched slightly at the shoulders as he leaned forward, eyes locking onto Aaliyah with a sharpness that made her chest tighten. "With respect," he repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "You're telling me about respect?" Aaliyah felt every eye in the room swing toward her again. The air felt thinner now, harder to breathe. Her mouth went dry, but she held her ground, fingers clenched tightly around the edge of her folder. "I'm just explaining the data," she said quietly. It's consistent with the trend lines we discussed last quarter. Mark let out a slow, exaggerated laugh. This is exactly the problem, he said, turning slightly to address the rest of the room as if Aaliyah weren't even there. We bring people in who can recite numbers, but they don't understand context, judgment, experience. He glanced back at her. Things you develop over time, not overnight. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone avoided her eyes. Another executive frowned, then quickly masked it. Aaliyah's heart pounded. She could feel heat climbing up her neck, her pulse thudding in her ears. She opened her mouth to respond, but Mark cut her off again, raising a hand. No, no, let me finish, he said sharply. You've had plenty of chances to speak. Her shoulders sagged just a fraction. Mark straightened, pacing slowly along the table like a lecturer addressing a class. We're not a training program. This isn't some feel-good initiative. This is a high-performance environment. His eyes flicked over her deliberately, her clothes, her posture, her face. And frankly, he continued, voice growing louder, some people just aren't equipped for it. The words landed like blows. Aaliyah felt her throat tight. She glanced instinctively toward the screen again, hoping without knowing why that someone would step in, say something, anything. No one did. On the screen, faces remained frozen in their little rectangles. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked bored. A few leaned closer, interest sharpening as the tension escalated. Mark stopped pacing and pointed at the slide behind her. Explain this, he said. This assumption right here, because from where I'm sitting it looks like you pulled it out of thin air. I didn't, Aaliyah replied, forcing her voice to stay steady. It's based on 3 years of comparable data across similar markets. Mark scoffed. Comparable according to who? According to the industry benchmarks you approved, she said softly. That was when his expression hardened. Careful, he warned. You're treading into territory you don't understand. Aaliyah's hands began to tremble again. She tried to hide it by clasping them together, nails digging into her palms. Pain grounded her, kept her present. I understand my work, she said. I worked very hard on this. There it was, the slightest tremor in her voice. Mark seized on it instantly. Hard work doesn't equal competence, he snapped. And effort doesn't make up for lack of aptitude. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone at the back shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the window pressed her lips together, eyes flicking between Mark and Aaliyah. Mark wasn't done. This company has standards, he continued, his voice rising. We can't lower the bar just because someone wants to be here. Aaliyah's vision blurred at the edges. She could feel tears threatening, hot and humiliating. She blinked rapidly, willing them away. Not here, not now. I'm not asking for the bar to be lowered, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm asking for a fair evaluation. Mark laughed again, louder this time. Fair, he said incredulously. You think this isn't fair? He turned to the room. Does anyone else feel like we're being unfair? Silence, heavy, deafening. No one spoke. Aaliyah's chest ached. The silence felt like a verdict, like everyone had quietly agreed that she deserved this. Mark turned back to her, satisfaction flickering briefly across his face. There you go, he said. Consensus. On the screen, a few muted microphones flickered as if someone considered speaking, then went still. Aaliyah swallowed hard. She felt exposed, stripped bare in front of colleagues and strangers alike, reduced to a stereotype, a punchline, a problem to be managed. Mark leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound intimate and cruel. You know, he said, I warned HR about rushing this hire. I said it was risky, but they wanted to check a box. The words hit her like ice water. Aaliyah's breath caught. I didn't get this job because of a quota, she said, her voice shaking now despite her efforts. I earned it. Mark straightened abruptly. Oh, please, he said sharply, don't embarrass yourself. A few people shifted again. Someone cleared their throat. Somewhere in the room, a phone camera tilted slightly, capturing every second. Aaliyah felt her face burn. Her ears rang. She could barely hear her own thoughts over the rush of blood in her head. She thought of her mother, of the empty prescription bottle, of the way Ruth had smiled at her that morning, pride shining through illness and exhaustion. Her chest tightened painfully. I just want to do my job, she said quietly. I want to contribute. Mark's expression hardened into something almost cold. Then maybe you should reconsider whether this is the right place for you, he said. Because right now you're wasting everyone's time. The words echoed in the glass room, wasting everyone's time. Aaliyah's shoulders slumped. The folder slipped slightly in her hands. Around her, the room felt impossibly large and impossibly empty at the same time. No one moved. No one spoke. The judgment hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. And as Mark gestured dismissively toward her chair, signaling that she should sit down and disappear, Aaliyah felt the full weight of her isolation crash down on her. She had walked into this room carrying hope. Now she stood alone under a spotlight she never asked for, facing cruelty without mercy, and she had no idea how much more she could endure. Aaliyah stood there a moment longer than she should have, not because she didn't understand Mark's gesture, but because her body refused to move. It was as if her feet had fused to the floor, pinned in place by the weight of every stare, every unspoken judgment pressing down on her at once. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Each beat echoed in her ears, drowning out the low hum of the conference room. She could feel tears gathering again, hot and insistent, blurring the polished faces in front of her into indistinct shapes. She told herself not to cry, don't give him that, but her body was betraying her. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. The words slipped out before she could stop them. The moment they left her mouth, she hated them. Sorry for what? For working too hard. For daring to speak, for existing in a space that had never truly welcomed her. Mark's eyebrows lifted slightly, a hint of triumph flickering across his face. Sorry doesn't fix incompetence, he replied coolly. It just confirms it. Aaliyah flinched. Her throat closed, and for a terrifying second she couldn't breathe. She pressed her lips together, fighting to regain control, but her chest felt tight, constricted. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the edges of her vision darkening. She glanced around again, desperate now, not for approval but for humanity. A woman near the window looked like she might say something. Her mouth opened just a fraction. Then she looked down at her hands. A man across the table shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, then focused intently on his laptop screen. On the wall-sized display, dozens of faces watched in silence, some curious, some uncomfortable, some completely detached, muted, all of them. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against Aaliyah's ears until it felt louder than Mark's insults, louder than the pounding of her heart, louder than her own thoughts. She had never felt so exposed, so alone. I didn't mean to disrupt the meeting, she said quietly, her voice breaking despite her efforts. If I've done something wrong, I can fix it. I can stay late. I can redo the analysis. Her voice cracked completely. She stopped speaking, unable to push the words past the tight knot in her throat. Tears finally spilled over, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. A soft gasp escaped her before she could stop it. Mark sighed dramatically, as if inconvenienced. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said, shaking his head. Emotional, unprofessional. Aaliyah felt something inside her collapse. The humiliation wasn't just public anymore, it was complete. There was nothing left to protect, no dignity left to salvage. She had been reduced to a spectacle, her pain dissected and dismissed in real time. She wiped her face quickly with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the gesture even as she did it. I'm sorry, she whispered again, though the words felt hollow now. Automatic. Mark leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. You know what, let's just move on, he said. We'll revisit this later offline. Offline, away from witnesses. Aaliyah understood exactly what that meant. She nodded numbly. Her legs finally responded, carrying her back toward her chair on unsteady feet. Each step felt heavy, as if she were wading through deep water. She lowered herself into the seat, staring down at the table in front of her. The folder lay open, her notes visible, pages of careful work now rendered meaningless. Her hands trembled in her lap. This is it, she thought dully. This is how it ends. She imagined herself leaving the building later that day, her badge deactivated. Imagined calling her mother with a voice she would try to keep steady. Imagined the empty prescription bottle, the eviction notice, the quiet unraveling of everything she had worked so hard to hold together. The thought was too much. Her chest ached with a deep, crushing heaviness. She stared at the reflection of the overhead lights in the polished table, fighting the urge to stand up and run, to escape this room, this moment, this version of herself that felt so small and powerless. Around her, the meeting continued as if nothing had happened. Voices droned on, slides changed. Laughter even bubbled up at one point, sharp and jarring. It was as if she had never spoken at all. That hurt more than anything Mark had said. The erasure. The way her pain had been acknowledged, dissected, and then discarded without a second thought. Aaliyah's shoulders slumped. She felt empty now, hollowed out by the effort of holding herself together. She considered gathering her things and leaving. Just slipping out quietly. No more humiliation. No more pretending she belonged somewhere she clearly didn't. She shifted in her chair, fingers brushing the strap of her bag, and that was when it happened. From the speaker system, cutting cleanly through the noise of the ongoing meeting, came a voice. Calm, measured, unmistakably present. Mark, it said. The room froze. Every voice fell silent mid-sentence. Heads turned. Chairs stilled. Aaliyah lifted her gaze slowly, heart lurching. The voice continued, steady and composed. I think you need to stop, now. The silence that followed was different, not heavy, expectant, and for the first time since the meeting began, Aaliyah felt something shift, as if the ground beneath her, which had been crumbling for so long, had suddenly found something solid to rest on. The silence stretched, taut, and electric. Mark blinked, clearly not used to being interrupted, especially not mid-meeting, and certainly not in that tone. He leaned toward the speaker, irritation flashing across his face. "I'm sorry," he said sharply. "Who is this?" Aaliyah's breath caught. She hadn't moved, hadn't even realized she was holding her breath until her chest began to ache. Slowly, she turned her head toward the large screen mounted at the front of the room. A new video tile had brightened, subtle but unmistakable. The man on screen looked to be in his early 50s, white, silver hair neatly combed back. He wore no tie, just a crisp navy blazer and an open collar shirt. His posture was relaxed, almost deceptively so, but there was something else there too. A quiet gravity, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. His eyes were steady, observant, kind. "I'm someone who's been listening," the man replied evenly. "And what I just heard was unacceptable." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Mark scoffed. "This is an internal discussion," he said. "If you're not directly involved in this project, I suggest you." "I am very directly involved," the man interrupted, still calm. "More than you realize." Aaliyah felt her heart stutter. The man's gaze shifted slightly on the screen, just enough that she had the strange sensation he was looking straight at her, not through her, not past her, at her. "Miss Thompson," he said gently, "are you all right?" The sound of her name, spoken without contempt, without impatience, spoken with simple human concern, hit her harder than any insult had. She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Mark let out an incredulous laugh. "Are you serious right now?" he said, turning partially toward the room. "We're stopping a strategic meeting for this." The man's expression didn't change. "Yes," he said, "we are." Aaliyah's fingers curled into her palms. Her pulse roared in her ears. She felt suddenly exposed again, but this time not in a way that made her want to disappear. This time she felt seen. "I asked if you're all right," the man repeated softly. Aaliyah swallowed, forcing herself to breathe. I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled. "I'm sorry if I caused a disruption." "No," the man replied immediately. "You did not." The firmness of his tone startled her. "You were presenting your work," he continued. "And from what I observed, you were interrupted repeatedly and spoken to in a manner that would be unacceptable for any professional environment." Mark's jaw tightened. "Hold on," he snapped. "You don't know the full context." "I know enough," the man said. "I know I heard a team lead publicly belittle an employee. I know I heard insinuations that had nothing to do with performance. And I know I heard silence from a room full of people who should know better." The words landed heavily. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. On the screen, a few muted faces looked suddenly very alert. Mark straightened, bristling. "Look, with all due respect," he said, "this is my team, and I run my meetings how I see fit." The man leaned slightly closer to his camera. "Respect is exactly what's been missing here," he said calmly. "And leadership is not measured by how loudly you speak, but by how responsibly you use your authority." Aaliyah felt a tightness in her chest loosen just a little. Mark shook his head. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said. "She couldn't defend her own work. That's not my fault." The man's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. "She attempted to," he said. "Multiple times. You didn't allow her to finish a sentence." "That's your interpretation," Mark shot back. "It's a fact," the man replied, "and it was witnessed by everyone on this call." The room was utterly still now. Aaliyah could feel it, the shift, the subtle recalibration of power. Mark was no longer performing for an audience that automatically agreed with him. He was being observed, measured, judged. "And another thing," the man continued, his voice still level, still controlled. "Using phrases like checking a box or questioning why someone was hired crosses a line. Those are not critiques. Those are prejudices." Mark's face flushed. "That's a serious accusation," he said tightly. "So is the behavior I just witnessed," the man replied. "And it won't be dismissed." Aaliyah felt tears well in her eyes again, but these were different. These were warm, disbelieving, almost painful in their relief. Someone was saying it out loud. Someone was naming what she had felt but hadn't dared to articulate. Mark laughed again, though the sound was thinner now, defensive. "And who exactly are you to lecture me about my management style?" The question hung in the air. Aaliyah held her breath. The man on the screen paused for just a moment, not because he needed time to think, but because he understood the weight of what came next. When he spoke again, his voice was still calm. "I'm someone who invests a great deal of money into this company," he said. "Someone who pays close attention to how its people are treated." Mark frowned. An investor, he said dismissively. Then you should understand results matter. I do, the man replied, which is why culture matters. Aaliyah glanced around the room. Several people were staring at the screen now, eyes wide. One executive subtly straightened in their chair. Another leaned forward, brows drawn together. Mark crossed his arms. If you've got feedback, you can take it up with HR, he said, but this isn't the time or place. The man's lips curved into the faintest, almost sad smile. Oh, he said quietly, it's exactly the time. He looked back at Aaliyah. You shouldn't have had to endure that, he said gently. And you shouldn't feel like you need to apologize for standing up for your work. Her throat tightened again. Thank you, she whispered. Mark threw his hands up. This is ridiculous, he said. We're letting emotions derail a business meeting. No, the man replied. We're letting accountability enter one. The word echoed. Accountability. Aaliyah felt something inside her straighten, like a spine that had been bent too long finally remembering its shape. Mark leaned back, scoffing. You're making a mountain out of nothing, he said. She's not cut out for this role, and that's the truth. The man's gaze sharpened. Then we will determine that fairly, he said, based on evidence, not bias. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the man leaned forward slightly, eyes locking with the camera. And for the record, he added calmly, you do not get to decide that on your own. The room went utterly silent. Aaliyah's heart raced, not with fear this time, but with something she barely recognized. Hope. Because whatever was happening now, whatever force had stepped into this storm, it was clear that Mark Havorson was no longer in control, and he still had no idea just how badly he had misjudged the situation. Mark Havorson let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head as if the entire exchange had become absurd. All right, he said, spreading his hands. Enough of this. You're an investor, great. Then you know exactly why we can't afford weak links. I won't apologize for demanding excellence. The man on the screen didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together. His expression wasn't angry, it wasn't smug, it was patient. The kind of patience that came from knowing time was on your side. Aaliyah, he said softly, turning his attention back to her. May I ask you a question? She startled at the sound of her name again, then nodded. Yes, sir. How long did you work on that model? She hesitated, unsure why it mattered now. 3 weeks, she answered honestly, mostly after hours. And before that, he asked. I reviewed 3 years of historical data, she said. I ran simulations, I stress-tested the assumptions, I documented everything. The man nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Thank you, he said. Mark scoffed. This is pointless, he muttered. We're not here to coddle, Mark, the man interrupted calmly. I need you to listen. Something in his tone, quiet but unyielding, made Mark stop mid-sentence. I joined this call today for one reason, the man continued. To observe. A few people in the room exchanged glances. Over the past 6 months, the man said, I've reviewed performance metrics, employee feedback, retention data, and internal culture reports from every department in this company. Mark's brow furrowed. And what I saw, the man went on, concerned me. The air in the room felt different now, heavier, sharper. Even the hum of the electronics seemed to fade. There were patterns, the man said. Teams with high turnover, disproportionate attrition among junior staff, repeated complaints about dismissive leadership styles. Mark's jaw tightened. And one name, the man added, looking directly into the camera, appeared again and again. A murmur rippled through the room. Mark straightened. If you're implying. I'm not implying, the man said evenly. I'm stating. The silence that followed was absolute. Aaliyah felt her heart pound as she looked from Mark to the screen. Her mind struggled to keep up with the shift unfolding before her. The man leaned forward again, his eyes no longer gentle but still controlled. My name, he said, is Jonathan Hale. The name hit the room like a shockwave. Several executives stiffened instantly. One woman's eyes widened in unmistakable recognition. Another man's mouth fell slightly open. Mark blinked. Jonathan Hale, he repeated slowly. Yes, the man said. Aaliyah watched Mark's confidence falter for the first time, just a crack, but it was there. The Jonathan Hale, Mark asked, his voice suddenly less certain. Jonathan inclined his head slightly. Founder of Hale Ventures, he said, lead investor in this company. The room erupted, not with noise, but with movement. Chairs shifted. People leaned forward. Someone's pen clattered softly onto the table. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. She had heard that name before. Everyone had. Hale Ventures wasn't just an investment firm, it was the firm. Known for reshaping companies from the inside out. Known for walking away from profitable deals when ethics were compromised. Known for one thing above all else. Zero tolerance for abuse of power, Mark swallowed. I wasn't aware you were on the call, he said quickly. That much is clear, Jonathan replied. The calmness of his voice was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. I join calls like this often, Jonathan continued. Usually without announcement, it helps me understand how people behave when they think no one important is listening. A few people visibly paled. Mark forced a smile. Well, he said stiffly, then you know how intense these meetings can get. Things get said, it's not personal. Jonathan's eyes hardened. It was personal, he said. You made it personal the moment you questioned why she was hired. Aaliyah felt a shiver run through her. Jonathan turned his attention fully to her now. Aaliyah Thompson, he said, do you know why I was especially interested in today's meeting? She shook her head, barely able to breathe. Because I reviewed your file last night, he said. Your academic record, your performance reviews, your project outcomes. Mark's eyes widened. And do you know what I saw? Jonathan asked. Aaliyah's voice trembled. No, sir. I saw consistency, he said. I saw rigor, I saw growth, and I saw someone whose work has quietly improved outcomes without ever being acknowledged for it. The room was frozen. Jonathan looked back at Mark. What I did not see, he continued, was any evidence that you had fairly evaluated her work today. Mark's face flushed deep red. You embarrassed her, Jonathan said calmly. In front of her peers, in front of senior leadership, in front of an audience of global colleagues. Mark opened his mouth, closed it again. And you did it, Jonathan added, while representing a company that I partially own. The weight of that sentence settled like a verdict. I won't tolerate that, Jonathan said. Mark's voice finally cracked. Mr. Hale, if there's been a misunderstanding. There hasn't, Jonathan replied. I heard everything. He paused. Then he said the words that would echo in that room for years to come. Effective immediately, Mark Havorson is removed from his leadership role. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Mark stared at the screen, stunned. You can't. I can, Jonathan said, and I am. He turned slightly as if addressing someone off screen. HR is already on standby, he said. Access will be suspended at the end of this call. Mark's face drained of color. This is outrageous, he sputtered. Over one meeting? Jonathan's gaze was unwavering. No, he said, over a pattern. The room was utterly silent now. Aaliyah felt dizzy. She sat there, hands trembling in her lap, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Just minutes ago, she had been preparing to disappear, to walk out quietly, broken and ashamed. Now the man who had humiliated her was unraveling in real time. Jonathan turned back to her. I'm sorry, he said simply, for what you experienced today. The sincerity in his voice broke something open inside her. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time no shame followed them. Thank you, she whispered. Jonathan nodded once. This meeting will continue, he said to the room, but it will do so without abuse. He paused, then added calmly, and with a reminder to everyone here, titles do not grant permission to dehumanize. No one spoke. No one dared to, because in that moment everyone understood the truth that had just been revealed. The most powerful person on the call hadn't raised his voice once, and yet everything had changed. The meeting ended in silence. Not the awkward, dismissive silence Aaliyah had felt earlier, but a heavy, reflective one. Screens went dark one by one. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people stood, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to leave a room where something irreversible had just happened. Mark Havorson was the first to move. He didn't look at Aaliyah, didn't look at anyone. He gathered his laptop with shaking hands, face pale, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched. The arrogance that had filled the room only minutes earlier was gone, replaced by something small and brittle. Two HR representatives were already waiting just outside the glass doors. Aaliyah watched as Mark was escorted out, his badge clipped from his jacket, his shoulders hunched as whispers followed him down the hallway. No one recorded now. No one laughed. Justice, she realized, was quiet when it arrived honestly. When the doors closed, the room remained still. Aaliyah sat frozen, unsure whether she was supposed to move, to stand, to leave. Her heart still raced, adrenaline buzzing through her veins. She felt exposed, like someone who had just survived a storm and wasn't yet sure it was over. Then Jonathan Hale spoke again. Everyone else, he said calmly, you're dismissed. There was no argument. People filed out quickly, some casting brief, regretful glances in Aaliyah's direction. A woman paused as if she wanted to say something, then thought better of it and followed the others. Soon only Aaliyah and the screen remained. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the room felt. Aaliyah, Jonathan said gently. She looked up at the screen, eyes still rimmed red. Yes, sir. Are you able to stay on the line for a few minutes? He asked. Her instinct was to apologize again, to explain, to shrink. Instead, she nodded. Yes. Good, he said, because this part matters. He leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. I want to be very clear, Jonathan continued. What happened to you today should never have happened, and it wasn't your fault. Aaliyah swallowed hard. I keep replaying it, she admitted quietly. Wondering what I should have said differently, Jonathan shook his head. That instinct to blame yourself is common, especially when you're used to having to prove you deserve to be in the room, but the problem wasn't your performance, it was the environment. She felt something unclench in her chest. I reviewed your work in detail last night, he went on. Not as a courtesy, as part of a broader review, your analysis was solid, conservative in its assumptions, clear in its methodology. Her breath caught. No one has ever said that to me, she confessed. Jonathan smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but sadly. That doesn't surprise me, he said, and that's part of what we're going to change. She blinked. We. Yes, he said, we. Aaliyah hesitated, then spoke the fear she had been holding since morning. Am I still employed? Jonathan didn't hesitate. Yes, he said firmly. And effective immediately, you'll be reassigned to a new team, one with leadership that understands accountability. Tears welled again. Thank you, she whispered, voice trembling. I really need this job. Jonathan studied her for a moment. I know, he said quietly. The simplicity of those two words hit her harder than any promise. There's something else, he continued. Your manager situation was not the only thing I reviewed. Aaliyah stiffened slightly. Your compensation, he said, your role classification, your workload. Her heart began to race again. You've been underpaid for the scope of your responsibilities, Jonathan said plainly. That's being corrected starting immediately. She stared at the screen, stunned. I what? There will be a salary adjustment, he said. Retroactive and a performance bonus for this quarter. Aaliyah pressed a hand to her mouth. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything yet, Jonathan replied gently. Just listen. He paused briefly, choosing his words. Earlier today, he said, you were treated as if you were disposable, as if your presence here was conditional. I want you to understand something. She leaned forward slightly, hanging on every word. You are not here by charity, Jonathan said. You are here because you earned your place. And from this point forward, that will be recognized. The tears spilled freely now. Thank you, she said again, the word inadequate but all she had. Jonathan nodded once. There's one more thing, he added, and this is not corporate, this is personal. Aaliyah's brow furrowed. I overheard part of your conversation before the meeting began, he said, about a prescription. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't realized her microphone was live that early. Jonathan raised a hand gently. You don't owe me details, he said, but I want you to know I grew up watching my mother ration medication. I know what that kind of fear does to a person. Aaliyah's breath caught painfully. I don't usually intervene this way, Jonathan continued, but I will not pretend this is just business. She shook her head. I wasn't trying to. I know, he said softly. He took a breath. There is a healthcare assistance fund attached to this company, Jonathan said. It exists for moments like this. It will cover your mother's medication, ongoing treatment, and any related care she needs. Aaliyah gasped. I can't accept that, she said automatically. You can, Jonathan replied, and you should, not as a favor but as support, because no one should have to choose between dignity and survival. Her shoulders shook as she cried openly now, hands trembling. My mom, she whispered. She's all I have. Jonathan's voice softened further. Then we'll make sure she's taken care of. He paused. Aaliyah, he added, this support isn't temporary, it's structured, long-term. She felt as if the floor beneath her had vanished, not into emptiness but into air. I don't know how to thank you, she said through tears. Jonathan smiled gently. One day, he said, you'll pay it forward, that's thanks enough. The call ended shortly after. Aaliyah sat alone in the conference room long after the screen went dark. For the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She felt held, seen, valued. She gathered her things slowly, her movements lighter than they had been all day. As she walked out of the room, she glanced once more at the glass walls. They no longer felt like barriers. They felt like windows. And for the first time, Aaliyah allowed herself to believe this wasn't just justice. This was the beginning of grace. 5 years later, the morning light fell softly through wide windows instead of cracked blinds. Aaliyah Thompson stood in a sunlit kitchen, stirring oatmeal on a modern stovetop while her mother laughed at something playing on the radio. Ruth sat at the small dining table, wrapped in a warm cardigan, her cheeks fuller now, her breathing steady and unlabored. The oxygen machine was gone, packed away years ago, never needed again. Don't burn it, Ruth teased. Aaliyah smiled. I've got it, Mama. Their home was modest but bright, clean lines, warm colors. Photos on the walls, graduation day, a company retreat, a candid shot of them both laughing on a park bench. Life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Aaliyah had grown into herself in ways she never imagined. She decompleted her master's degree part-time, fully funded. She now led a small but thriving analytics team, known not for fear or ego, but for collaboration and respect. Her office had an open-door policy, not as a slogan, as a promise. That morning she dressed carefully, not out of anxiety but intention. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman confident in her posture, calm in her eyes. The old second-hand blazer had been retired long ago, but she kept it folded in the back of her closet. A reminder. At work, her calendar was full. Mentorship sessions, a presentation to the board, a lunch meeting with two interns who reminded her very much of herself. One of them hesitated at her door. "Ms. Thompson." Young woman asked softly, "Do you have a minute?" Aaliyah smiled. "Always." The girl stepped in, clutching a notebook to her chest. I wanted to say thank you," she said. "For the way you handled the meeting earlier, I've never seen someone shut down disrespect like that without raising their voice." Aaliyah felt a familiar warmth bloom in her chest. "Respect doesn't require volume," she said gently. "It requires clarity." Later that afternoon, Aaliyah received a message. "Proud of you, always." Jonathan, they didn't speak often anymore. They didn't need to. His role in her life had never been about control, only about opening a door and trusting her to walk through it. That evening, Aaliyah and her mother sat on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker on. The air was warm, peaceful. "You remember that meeting?" Ruth asked suddenly, a smile playing at her lips. Aaliyah laughed softly. "How could I forget? I knew something would change that day," Ruth said. "I just didn't know how much." Aaliyah looked out over the same city that had once felt so cold, so unforgiving. "It changed me," she said quietly. "But it also showed me who I wanted to be." She thought of the silence that had once crushed her, and of the calm voice that had broken it, and of the choice she made every day now to be that voice for someone else. Moral of the story: true power is not in humiliation, but in humanity. When we choose compassion over silence, we don't just change moments, we change lives. Never underestimate the impact of standing up when someone is being torn down. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, inspirational stories that remind us who we can be at our best.